Some men wear a badge to protect people. Others wear it to decide who deserves respect. The rain had just started falling over Westfield Avenue, turning the cracked sidewalks of South Columbus, Ohio into mirrors of flashing red and blue lights, when Officer Brett Collins stepped out of his patrol car with the kind of confidence that only came from years of never being questioned. His boots hit the pavement hard as his eyes locked onto an older black man standing near the bus stop bench beneath a flickering street lamp. Earl Washington kept both hands visible, one gripping a worn duffel bag, while the other rested gently against a silver cane polished smooth from years of use. At 72 years old, Earl carried himself with quiet dignity, his dark green Army veteran jacket zipped all the way to his neck despite the humid summer rain. A small bronze service pin glimmered near his collar under the streetlight. Most people walking by barely noticed him, but Officer Collins did. And from the moment he saw Earl standing there alone, soaked by the rain with tired eyes and dark skin, something in his expression changed. Suspicion came first, then judgment, then the cold satisfaction of power. "You waiting for someone, old man?" Collins asked as he approached, one hand resting casually near his belt. Earl looked up slowly, calm even as water dripped from the edge of his gray beard. "Just waiting for the number 14 bus, son," he replied softly. His voice carried the slow steadiness of someone who had lived long enough to stop rushing his words. But Collins didn't smile, didn't nod, didn't hear the humanity in that answer. Instead, his eyes dropped to the duffel bag sitting beside Earl's feet. "What's in the bag?" Earl blinked once. "Personal belongings." Collins stepped closer, mind opening it. Around them, the city kept moving. Cars splashed through puddles. Neon diner signs buzzed in the distance. Somewhere across the street, a teenager lowered his phone slightly, sensing tension before anyone else did. Earl adjusted his grip on the cane carefully. "Officer, I've done nothing wrong." The rain fell harder now, tapping against the roof of the bus stop shelter like nervous fingers against glass. Collins let out a dry laugh. "That's usually what people say before I find something." Earl stayed silent for a moment. Not angry, not afraid, just tired. Tired in the way only a man could be after surviving wars overseas, only to come home and still be treated like a threat on his own street. "I served this country for 26 years, Earl finally said. "I'm just trying to get home." Collins glanced at the old Army patch on Earl's shoulder and smirked like it meant nothing. "Yeah? And I'm supposed to take your word for it?" Then, without waiting for permission, Collins reached down and grabbed the duffel bag off the wet concrete. The zipper snapped open. A folded American flag, prescription bottles, a framed photograph wrapped carefully in plastic, and one old military medal tied with a faded blue ribbon spilled onto the pavement beneath the rain. Earl's face changed instantly. Not rage, not panic, something worse. Heartbreak. He bent slowly, trying to protect the medal from the puddles, but Collins stepped in front of him first. "Stay where you are." The words cut through the rain like a judge's gavel. Across the street, people had started stopping now, watching, whispering. Earl stared down at the medal lying in dirty water while red police lights flashed across his face. And for the first time that night, Officer Brett Collins noticed something strange. The old man never begged, never argued, never raised his voice. He just looked at that medal like it carried the weight of an entire lifetime. What Collins didn't know was that within the next 15 minutes, the man standing in front of him would no longer look like a helpless old veteran. Because someone was already driving toward that scene. Someone with authority powerful enough to make an entire police department fall silent. And when Captain Marcus Washington arrived and saw his father standing in the rain beside that medal, Officer Collins was going to realize the biggest mistake of his career had already been made. The medal rested in the rainwater between Earl Washington and Officer Brett Collins like something sacred that had been carelessly dropped into the dirt. For a few seconds, neither man moved. The flashing patrol lights painted the wet sidewalk in waves of blue and red, while distant thunder rolled over Columbus like a warning no one wanted to hear. Earl slowly lowered himself onto one knee despite the stiffness in his back, reaching carefully toward the medal with trembling fingers. Collins immediately stepped forward again. "I said stay where you are." His voice was louder this time, sharper, meant for the growing crowd gathering beneath umbrellas and storefront awnings across the street. People had started recording now. Quiet whispers drifted through the humid air. Some recognized Earl from the neighborhood. Others only saw another older black man being treated like a criminal in public. Earl stopped moving, not because he was afraid of Collins, but because years of experience had taught him exactly how dangerous the wrong movement could become. The rain soaked through his jacket collar as he lifted his tired eyes toward the officer standing above him. "That medal belonged to my unit," Earl said quietly. "Please do not step on it." Collins glanced down at the bronze star near his boot. For the first time, something uncertain flickered across his face, but it vanished almost instantly beneath pride. "Maybe you should have thought about that before acting suspicious." Earl let out a slow breath through his nose. There was disappointment in it more than anger. "Suspicious," he repeated softly, almost to himself. The words seemed to hang in the cold night air heavier than the rain. Collins folded his arms. "You standing out here carrying bags, refusing questions, making people uncomfortable." "Yeah, suspicious." Across the street, a woman inside the diner shook her head quietly while watching through the fogged window. A teenage employee near the register whispered, "That old man did not even do anything." But nobody stepped outside. Nobody interrupted. They simply watched the scene unfold the same way people always watched when power decided to make an example out of someone. Earl finally looked back down at the medal lying beside the puddle. "You know," he said calmly, "there was a time when this uniform meant something to me." Collins frowned slightly. "What uniform?" Earl touched the old army patch stitched onto his sleeve. "This one." The officer laughed under his breath. "Anybody can buy one of those jackets at a thrift store." That sentence hit harder than Collins realized. Earl did not react outwardly, but something dimmed behind his eyes. Not fear, not humiliation, something quieter. The exhaustion of a man realizing that even after decades of sacrifice, some people would still look at his skin before they looked at his service. A city bus roared past without stopping, spraying water along the curb. Earl watched it disappear down the avenue. That had been his ride home. Collins noticed. "Looks like you missed your bus." Earl nodded once. "Looks that way." Then suddenly, another set of headlights turned onto Westfield Avenue from the far intersection. A black unmarked police SUV moved through the rain slowly before stopping at the red light, half a block away. Collins barely noticed it at first. He was too focused on maintaining control of the moment, too focused on the crowd watching him. "Stand up," he ordered Earl. Earl used his cane carefully and rose with visible effort. The years showed in every movement now. Collins picked up the framed photograph that had fallen from the duffel bag earlier. Rainwater streaked across the glass, but the image underneath was still visible. A younger Earl stood proudly beside a tall black man in dress police uniform during a promotion ceremony. Collins narrowed his eyes at the badge on the younger man's chest. Captain Marcus Washington. The name landed in his chest like ice water. Before Collins could process it fully, the unmarked SUV pulled sharply to the curb beside the flashing patrol car. The engine shut off. The driver door opened. And the moment Captain Marcus Washington stepped out into the rain wearing a dark command jacket with silver captain bars shining beneath the streetlights, the entire atmosphere on Westfield Avenue changed. Rain rolled down Captain Marcus Washington's jacket as he stepped out of the black SUV and closed the door behind him with slow precision. The flashing patrol lights reflected across his face, sharp against the darkness of the street, while the crowd gathered near the diner suddenly fell silent. Even the whispers stopped. There was something about the way Marcus carried himself that changed the air around him instantly. Calm, controlled, dangerous only because he did not need to raise his voice to command attention. Officer Brett Collins felt his stomach tighten the moment their eyes met. He recognized Marcus immediately. Everyone in the department did. 3 months earlier, Captain Washington had been transferred into Columbus Metro with one mission nobody openly discussed, but everybody understood: clean up the corruption unit by unit. Since arriving, Marcus had reopened old complaints, disciplined officers people thought were untouchable, and made it painfully clear that the badge did not place anyone above accountability. Collins swallowed hard as Marcus's eyes shifted past him and landed on Earl standing alone in the rain. For a brief second, the captain's expression cracked. Not publicly, not enough for anyone else to notice. But a son always recognized when his father had been humiliated. Marcus stepped forward slowly, his polished shoes splashing through shallow puddles until he stopped beside Earl. "Dad," he said quietly. Earl gave a small nod, trying to force a tired smile onto his face. "Evening, son." Marcus looked down at the soaked metal lying near the curb, then at the open duffel bag, then finally at the photograph still clutched awkwardly in Collins's hand. The silence stretched painfully across Westfield Avenue. Collins cleared his throat. "Captain, I did not realize." "No," Marcus interrupted softly. "You did not." His voice never rose. That was what unsettled Collins most. Marcus bent down and carefully picked up the metal from the rainwater with both hands, as though it deserved respect no one else had shown it tonight. Water dripped from the bronze star while the captain wiped it gently against his sleeve before handing it back to Earl. "You should not have had to pick this up off the ground," Marcus said. Earl lowered his eyes. "It is all right." But Marcus shook his head once. "No, sir. It is not." Across the street, more phones had appeared now. People were recording openly. The teenager outside the diner whispered to his friend, "That is the captain." Collins shifted uncomfortably beneath the weight of dozens of eyes watching him in complete silence. He tried to straighten his posture. "Captain, your father matched the description of a suspicious individual reported in the area. I was conducting procedure." Marcus turned toward him slowly. "Procedure." The words sounded colder coming from him than anger ever could. "Tell me something, Officer Collins. Did procedure require dumping an elderly veteran's belongings onto the sidewalk in the middle of a storm?" Collins opened his mouth, but nothing came out immediately. Marcus stepped closer. "Did procedure require making him miss his ride home?" Earl touched Marcus lightly on the arm. "Son, let it go." Marcus looked at his father for a moment, and suddenly the captain disappeared. In his place was simply a boy seeing the man who raised him standing alone in the rain, while strangers watched him like he was less than human. Earl Washington had worked factory shifts after returning from the army so Marcus could go to college. He had spent years teaching his son never to hate people back, no matter how badly they treated him. And now here he stood at 72 years old, soaked and exhausted beneath flashing police lights in the city his son helped protect. Marcus inhaled slowly before turning back toward Collins. "My father carried wounded soldiers through enemy fire when he was younger than you," he said quietly. Tonight he could not even wait for a bus without being treated like a threat. Collins looked around nervously as another patrol car pulled onto the street nearby. Two younger officers stepped out, immediately freezing when they recognized Captain Washington standing beside Earl. The atmosphere changed again. Tension spread through the officers like electricity moving across wet pavement. Because everyone suddenly understood this was no longer about a misunderstanding at a bus stop. Something much bigger had just begun. The rain kept falling over Westfield Avenue, but nobody moved anymore. Not the crowd gathered outside the diner. Not the younger officers standing stiff beside the second patrol car. Not even Officer Brett Collins, whose face had slowly lost the confidence he carried only minutes earlier. The sound of water tapping against police lights and bus stop glass filled the silence, while Captain Marcus Washington stood beside his father, holding the soaked military medal in one hand. There was something deeply uncomfortable about the scene now. Not because a high-ranking officer had arrived, but because everyone watching suddenly understood the truth Earl Washington had been trying to say all along. He had never been dangerous. He had never been suspicious. He had simply been black, old, and alone in the wrong place at the wrong time. Marcus turned his eyes toward the two younger officers who had just arrived. Officer Daniel Ruiz and Officer Chloe Bennett both straightened immediately. "Who is supervising this stop?" Marcus asked calmly. Neither officer answered at first. Collins finally cleared his throat. "I am." Marcus nodded once. "Body cameras?" Ruiz hesitated briefly before answering. "Active, Captain." Collins's jaw tightened almost invisibly. Marcus looked directly at him. "Good." The word landed heavily. Collins suddenly understood what everyone else already had. This moment was recorded. Every word, every command, every decision made under those flashing lights would now exist beyond excuses and rewritten reports. Marcus carefully handed the medal back to Earl before kneeling beside the open duffel bag himself. Rainwater soaked through the knees of his uniform pants as he gently picked up the folded American flag and placed it back inside. Then the prescription bottles. Then the framed photograph. He handled every item with a level of care that made the crowd even quieter. Imagine standing there watching a police captain repack his own father's belongings from the wet sidewalk, while another officer stood frozen beside him. Imagine realizing the man being humiliated moments earlier had once worn the uniform of his country with more honor than the people surrounding him now. Earl looked down at his son with tired eyes. Marcus, enough. Let us just go home. Marcus stopped moving for a second. Home. The word hit him harder than anything Collins had said all night. Because home was supposed to be the one place Earl Washington never had to defend his dignity. Yet here they were under cold Ohio rain, while strangers filmed his humiliation on their phones. Marcus stood slowly. Dad? He said quietly. Did he ever tell you why he stopped you? Earl remained silent. Collins answered instead. There was a report about someone matching his description near a convenience store theft 2 blocks away. Marcus looked at him carefully. And what exactly was the description? Collins shifted his weight. Older black male. Green jacket. Carrying a bag. The silence afterward was devastating. Even the younger officers looked uncomfortable now. Officer Bennett lowered her eyes toward the pavement. Marcus nodded slowly as though confirming something painful he already knew. That is all it took. Collins immediately became defensive. Captain, I followed procedure. Marcus stepped closer, rain dripping from the edge of his jawline. No, Officer Collins. Procedure is asking questions with respect. Procedure is assessing facts before assumptions. Procedure is remembering that wearing a badge does not give you ownership over another person's dignity. Collins looked away briefly toward the crowd recording everything. His voice dropped lower. I did not know who he was. Marcus stared at him for several long seconds before answering. That is exactly the problem. The words hung in the air heavier than thunder. Because everybody understood what he meant. Earl should not have needed to be the father of a captain to deserve basic respect. He should not have needed medals, photographs, military service, or family connections to be treated like a human being standing at a bus stop. Marcus turned toward Ruiz. Call internal affairs. Collins's head snapped back immediately. Captain, come on. But Marcus did not raise his voice. Tonight is no longer about one stop on one street. Tonight is about every moment somebody decided a black man looked suspicious before he even spoke. Across the street, the teenager holding his phone whispered softly, he is right. And for the first time since the rain began falling over Westfield Avenue, Officer Brett Collins finally looked uncertain about the badge resting on his own chest. Officer Brett Collins could feel the street turning against him one silent stare at a time. The rain had softened into a cold mist now, but the tension hanging over Westfield Avenue only grew heavier with every passing second. Across the street, people remained beneath storefront awnings and diner lights, still watching, still recording, their faces lit by glowing phone screens and flashing patrol lights. Collins had spent years believing the uniform protected him from moments like this. Believing procedure could always be rewritten later. Believing the version told by an officer would matter more than the experience lived by someone else. But tonight felt different. Tonight there was no shouting crowd. No chaos to hide behind. Only truth standing quietly in the rain beside a 72-year-old veteran and his son. Internal affairs was already on the way. Officer Daniel Ruiz stepped aside near the patrol car, speaking into his radio in a low voice, while Officer Chloe Bennett remained frozen near the curb, unable to stop glancing at Earl Washington. Earl looked exhausted now. Rainwater darkened the shoulders of his old army jacket, while the silver cane trembled faintly in his hand from standing too long. Marcus noticed immediately. Dad, sit down for a second. Earl resisted at first. Pride had carried him through war zones, factory floors, funerals, and decades of surviving a country that often questioned his worth. But his knees finally gave in to age and fatigue. Marcus guided him carefully onto the bus stop bench beneath the flickering light. For a moment, the captain forgot about the officers, the cameras, and the crowd. He only saw his father sitting there soaked from the storm while holding a military medal against his chest like something fragile. Earl stared quietly at the passing traffic before speaking under his breath. Your mother used to hate when I wore this jacket. Marcus managed a faint smile despite everything. Because it is older than I am. Earl nodded softly. She said one day it would fall apart on me. The mention of his late mother hit Marcus harder than expected. For a brief second, he remembered being a little boy watching Earl polish those medals at the kitchen table every Veterans Day while explaining what sacrifice meant. Earl never taught hatred, never taught revenge. Even after Marcus's cousin was wrongfully arrested years ago. even after neighbors were stopped and searched for no reason other than skin color. Earl always said the same thing. Do not let bitterness become your uniform. Marcus looked down at the wet sidewalk. I am trying, Dad. Earl placed a tired hand over his son's wrist. I know. Behind them, Collins shifted uneasily as another unmarked vehicle approached the scene. A woman in a dark overcoat stepped out carrying a leather folder beneath one arm. Lieutenant Sandra Hayes from Internal Affairs. The moment Collins saw her, the color drained slightly from his face. Hayes walked through the rain without urgency, but there was something cold and methodical about her presence. She nodded respectfully toward Marcus first before turning toward Collins. Officer, I need your body camera uploaded immediately. Collins straightened defensively. Lieutenant, this situation is being misunderstood. Hayes did not react. Then the footage will clarify everything. Her eyes shifted toward Earl sitting quietly on the bench. Sir, are you injured? Earl shook his head gently. No, ma'am. Just tired. Those 3 words seemed to echo deeper than anything else spoken that night. Just tired. Tired of being looked at with suspicion. Tired of proving dignity to strangers. Tired of surviving battles overseas only to return home and still be treated like he did not belong on his own sidewalk. Lieutenant Hayes opened her folder and glanced briefly at Collins's disciplinary history. The expression on her face changed almost invisibly. Marcus noticed. So did Collins. Officer Collins, Hayes said calmly. This is not the first complaint involving profiling concerns attached to your name, is it? Collins immediately tensed. Those complaints were never sustained. Hayes closed the folder slowly. No, they were not. The way she answered made it clear that fact no longer carried the protection it once did. A long silence followed while rainwater dripped from the bus shelter roof in steady rhythm. Then Earl looked up toward Collins for the first time since Marcus arrived. There was no hatred in his face. No anger. Only disappointment, so deep it seemed to age the entire street around them. Son, Earl said quietly, when I wore my uniform overseas, I defended people I had never met before. I just wish tonight somebody remembered I was one of them too. And standing there beneath flashing lights with Internal Affairs watching, Officer Brett Collins finally understood that the most painful moments were not always loud. Sometimes they arrived in the form of one exhausted old man speaking the truth softly enough for everyone to hear. The street outside the diner no longer felt like an ordinary police stop. It felt like a courtroom without walls. Every face watching from beneath umbrellas and glowing storefront windows carried the same uneasy expression now. The realization that something deeply wrong had unfolded right in front of them, while nobody stepped in to stop it. Lieutenant Sandra Hayes stood beside the patrol car reviewing preliminary information on her tablet while rainwater slid from the edge of her coat sleeves. Officer Brett Collins remained several feet away, stiff and silent, no longer speaking with the authority he carried earlier that night. The confidence had drained out of him little by little ever since Captain Marcus Washington stepped onto Westfield Avenue. Marcus stood near the bus stop bench beside Earl, arms folded tightly across his chest while he watched Internal Affairs begin documenting the scene. He knew this process too well. Statements would be taken, footage reviewed, reports compared. But he also knew something else. Cases like this usually disappeared quietly when nobody important was connected to them. Tonight, the only reason people were listening was because the old black veteran sitting beneath the flickering bus shelter happened to be his father. That truth sat heavily in Marcus's chest. Earl adjusted the folded American flag inside his duffel bag with slow, careful movements. His hand still shook faintly from the cold. Marcus, he said softly, you should not make this bigger than it already is. Marcus looked at him in disbelief. Bigger? Earl nodded once. I have seen worse. The words landed like stones in the rain. Imagine hearing a 72-year-old Army veteran say he had seen worse treatment in his own country and realizing he meant it honestly. Marcus crouched slightly in front of his father. That does not make this acceptable. Earl gave him a tired smile. No, but anger can become heavy if you carry it too long. Across the street, the teenager who had been recording lowered his phone slowly. Even strangers standing nearby seemed affected by Earl's calmness. There was no screaming, no threats, no desire for revenge. Just dignity surviving humiliation with painful grace. Lieutenant Hayes suddenly walked toward Marcus holding the tablet against her chest. Captain, I need to inform you of something before this moves further. Marcus straightened immediately. Hayes lowered her voice. Officer Collins has had 4 prior complaints involving unnecessary stops and profiling concerns over the last 3 years. Marcus's jaw tightened. And he is still on patrol. Hayes glanced briefly toward Collins before answering carefully. None of the complaints were sustained due to insufficient evidence. Marcus let out a humorless breath, meaning nobody important was recording. Hayes did not answer. She did not need to. Nearby, Collins overheard enough to understand where the conversation was heading. His face hardened again, this time from fear rather than authority. Captain, with all due respect, I never touched your father aggressively. I never threatened him. Marcus turned slowly toward him. You destroyed his dignity in public. Collins shook his head defensively. I made a judgment call. Marcus stepped closer through the ring. Exactly. Silence followed again. Because everybody there understood the real issue now. The problem was never only one officer or one stop. The problem was how quickly suspicion appeared when the person standing alone happened to be black. Collins looked around at the watching crowd and suddenly seemed smaller beneath the flashing lights. I did not know he was your father, he repeated weakly. Marcus stared at him for several long seconds before speaking. You keep saying that like it would excuse tonight if he was somebody else. Those words hit harder than any shouting ever could. Officer Chloe Bennett quietly lowered her eyes while Officer Ruiz shifted uncomfortably near the patrol car. Even Lieutenant Hayes looked away for a moment. Earl finally stood again using his cane carefully. The rain had almost stopped now, leaving the pavement shining beneath the streetlights. He looked directly at Collins, not with hatred but with sadness deep enough to silence the entire street. Young man, Earl said softly. When people looked at me overseas, they saw an American soldier first. Tonight you saw my skin before anything else. Collins opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Earl nodded once as though confirming a truth he had carried for decades. That is what hurts the most. A distant siren echoed somewhere downtown while the cameras kept recording. And standing beneath the fading rain beside his father, Marcus Washington realized this night was no longer just an investigation. It had become a mirror nobody in that department could comfortably look away from anymore. By the time the rain finally stopped over Westfield Avenue, the city no longer sounded the same. The distant traffic had quieted. The diner conversations across the street had faded into silence. Even the flashing patrol lights seemed softer now against the wet pavement, as though the entire neighborhood understood it had just witnessed something far bigger than a routine police stop. Earl Washington stood beneath the bus shelter with his old duffel bag resting beside him, while Captain Marcus Washington remained close at his side. Lieutenant Sandra Hayes continued speaking quietly with internal affairs over her phone, occasionally glancing toward Officer Brett Collins, who now looked trapped inside the consequences of his own decisions. For the first time all night, Collins appeared unsure where to place his hands, where to look, or even how to stand. The badge on his chest no longer carried certainty. It carried weight. Marcus watched him carefully. Not with satisfaction. Not with revenge. Just disappointment. The kind that cuts deeper because it comes from someone who once believed law enforcement could still become better than this. You know what the hardest part is? Marcus suddenly asked, his voice low but clear enough for everyone nearby to hear. Collins looked up slowly. Marcus gestured gently toward Earl. My father still believes in this country more than most people wearing a uniform do. Earl lowered his eyes modestly, uncomfortable being the center of attention. But Marcus continued. This man worked 30 years after coming home from war. Paid taxes. Raised a family. Buried friends. Buried my mother. And tonight he stood in the rain trying to explain he belonged at a bus stop in his own neighborhood. Collins swallowed hard. Captain, I made a mistake. Marcus nodded once. No. A mistake is forgetting paperwork. A mistake is taking the wrong exit. He stepped closer, not aggressively, but with painful calm. What happened tonight came from assumption. You saw an older black man carrying a bag and decided he was suspicious before he even spoke. Collins looked away again, because he knew Marcus was right. Across the street, several people still held phones pointed toward the scene. One older woman, standing near the diner entrance, wiped tears from her face quietly. She had watched Earl sit alone at that same bus stop many evenings over the years after visiting the pharmacy nearby. He always nodded politely at strangers, always carried himself with quiet grace. And tonight she watched him forced to defend his existence simply because someone in power decided fear mattered more than humanity. Lieutenant Hayes finally approached, holding a printed form protected beneath a plastic folder. "Officer Collins," she said formally, "effective immediately, your active patrol status is suspended pending investigation." The words settled heavily into the cold night air. Collins blinked slowly as though he had expected consequences, but not reality itself arriving this fast. "Lieutenant, turn over your service credentials for the evening." Collins hesitated only briefly before unclipping his badge holder with stiff fingers. The sound of metal touching plastic echoed louder than it should have. Marcus watched silently while Collins handed over the symbol that had once made him feel untouchable. Imagine standing there watching a man lose authority not because someone destroyed him, but because truth finally caught up with him. Collins looked toward Earl again, his voice quieter now than at any moment before. "Sir, I am sorry." Earl studied him for several seconds beneath the flickering bus stop light. The old veteran looked exhausted, but there was still kindness somewhere behind the pain in his eyes. "I believe you regret tonight," Earl said softly. "But regret is not the same thing as understanding." Collins stared at him silently. Earl adjusted the folded American flag inside his bag before continuing. "One bad night for you becomes another memory someone like me carries forever." Those words landed across the street like thunder, even though his voice barely rose above a whisper. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. Because everyone listening understood the truth hidden inside that sentence. Marcus looked at his father with quiet admiration. Even now, after humiliation, suspicion, and public shame, Earl Washington still chose wisdom over hatred. Lieutenant Hayes closed her folder slowly while Officer Ruiz removed the final evidence markers from near the curb. The storm had passed, but something else had changed permanently on Westfield Avenue that night. A crowd that arrived expecting another forgettable police stop had instead witnessed dignity standing face to face with power. And in the end, dignity never needed to shout to be stronger. The crowd slowly began to thin out after Lieutenant Sandra Hayes collected Officer Brett Collins's credentials, but the feeling hanging over Westfield Avenue refused to disappear. Some people walked away quietly with their phones still in hand, replaying the footage they had just recorded. Others lingered near the diner windows as if leaving too soon would somehow erase what they had witnessed. The city lights reflected across the wet pavement, while Earl Washington stood beneath the bus shelter beside his son, looking smaller somehow now that the adrenaline of the moment had faded. Marcus noticed it immediately, the exhaustion in Earl's shoulders, the way his hand tightened around the cane. The deep silence older people carry when life has disappointed them too many times to count. "Dad," Marcus said softly, "let me drive you home." Earl nodded this time without resistance. He was tired. Not just physically. Tired in the way a person becomes after spending decades swallowing moments that chip away at dignity little by little. Before they could leave, Lieutenant Hayes stepped closer, holding a small evidence envelope. Inside was Earl's military medal, now cleaned and dried carefully with a cloth. Hayes handed it back respectfully with both hands. "Sir," she said quietly, "this belongs with you." Earl accepted it gently, staring at the bronze star for a moment beneath the bus stop light. "Thank you." Hayes hesitated before speaking again. "For what it is worth, my father served too." Earl looked at her and offered a faint smile. "Then you understand what these mean." Hayes nodded once. "Yes, sir." Across the street, Officer Collins remained beside the patrol vehicle waiting for transportation back to the station. Without the authority of his badge clipped to his chest, he suddenly looked ordinary. Smaller somehow. Human. Marcus glanced toward him briefly before helping Earl step toward the SUV. But just as they reached the curb, Collins spoke again. "Captain." Marcus stopped without turning around. Collins swallowed visibly. "I know saying sorry is not enough." Marcus looked back slowly. "No. It is not." Collins nodded as though he expected the answer. Rainwater still clung to his uniform sleeves, while red and blue lights flashed faintly across his face. "But I need you to know, I never thought of myself as racist." The street became quiet again. Marcus studied him carefully before answering. "Most people do not." Collins looked confused by the response. Marcus continued calmly. "That is what makes it dangerous." Earl listened silently nearby, while Marcus stepped closer toward Collins one final time. You did not wake up tonight planning to humiliate an old black veteran. You simply trusted your assumptions more than his humanity. Collins lowered his eyes. Marcus gestured toward the nearly empty street around them. You saw a bag before you saw a man. You saw skin before service. Fear before facts. Collins looked emotionally exhausted now, like someone finally seeing himself clearly for the first time and not liking the reflection. I really thought I was doing my job. Marcus nodded slowly. And my father really thought wearing his country's uniform meant something when he came home. Those words settled heavily into the cold night air. Earl finally stepped forward slightly, resting both hands atop his cane. Young man, he said softly to Collins, people are not asking you to be perfect. They are asking you to see them. Collins stared at him speechless. Earl continued, the hardest thing about being treated unfairly is not the anger afterward. It is the loneliness during it. Standing there while people look through you instead of at you. Across the street, the diner waitress who had watched the entire scene quietly wiped another tear from her cheek. Because she understood exactly what Earl meant. So did Officer Bennett. So did Ruiz. Maybe even Collins now. Marcus opened the SUV door carefully for his father. Before Earl got inside, he paused for one last glance at the street where everything happened. The bus stop, the puddles, the flashing lights fading into the distance. Funny thing, Earl murmured quietly, almost to himself. I spent years overseas believing home would always feel safer. Marcus looked at his father, unable to answer immediately, because some truths were too heavy for words. Earl slowly sat inside the SUV while Marcus closed the door gently behind him. And standing there beneath the quiet Ohio night, Marcus Washington realized the real tragedy was not that one officer made a terrible decision. The tragedy was how familiar nights like this had become for people who looked like his father. The drive home was quiet. Rainwater slid across the windshield of Marcus Washington's SUV while the city lights of Columbus blurred into soft streaks of gold and red outside the windows. Earl Washington sat in the passenger seat holding his military medal gently in both hands, his thumb brushing across the worn bronze edges the same way someone might touch an old scar they never fully stopped feeling. Marcus kept both hands tight on the steering wheel as silence filled the space between them. Not an uncomfortable silence. A heavy one. The kind shared between people who loved each other deeply but understood there were some wounds words could not easily reach. After several blocks, Earl finally spoke. You should not let tonight harden your heart, son. Marcus exhaled quietly without taking his eyes off the road. That is difficult right now. Earl nodded slightly. I know. They passed an American flag hanging outside a closed hardware store, still damp from the storm. Earl watched it disappear behind them through the passenger window. When I came home from Vietnam, he said softly, I thought things would change faster than they did. Marcus glanced toward him briefly. Earl continued staring ahead. Back then people looked at us like we did not belong either. Even in uniform. The words settled heavily inside the vehicle. Marcus had heard pieces of those stories growing up, but Earl rarely spoke about the deeper pain. Not because he forgot it. Because he spent his entire life trying not to pass bitterness down to his son. So how did you keep believing in people after all that? Marcus asked quietly. Earl smiled faintly. Because if I stopped believing completely, then they would have taken more from me than my peace. They would have taken my humanity too. Marcus looked back toward the road, fighting the tightness building in his chest. Across town, Officer Brett Collins sat alone inside a dim office at Internal Affairs headquarters answering questions beneath fluorescent lights that suddenly felt much colder than before. The footage from Westfield Avenue had already begun circulating online. Not edited. Not manipulated. Just raw truth recorded by ordinary people standing in the rain. Collins watched part of the video replay silently on a monitor across the room. Earl standing beside the bus stop. The metal falling into the puddle. The old veteran quietly asking not to have it stepped on. Collins lowered his eyes slowly. For the first time in years, he was forced to see himself the way others had seen him. Not as an officer protecting the city, but as a man who allowed assumptions to overpower compassion. Lieutenant Sandra Hayes closed the case folder carefully. Do you understand now why this matters? Collins stared at the paused image of Earl Washington sitting beneath flashing police lights. Yes, he answered quietly. But even he knew understanding had arrived too late for the damage already done. Meanwhile, Marcus pulled into the driveway of Earl's small brick house on the east side of Columbus just after midnight. The porch light glowed warmly against the darkness while rain dripped softly from the roof gutters. Marcus stepped out first and hurried around to help his father from the passenger seat. Earl moved slowly, exhaustion visible in every step now. Before entering the house, he paused on the porch and looked out across the quiet neighborhood. "Funny thing," Earl murmured softly. "Tomorrow morning this street will wake up like nothing happened tonight." Marcus stood beside him silently. Earl smiled sadly. "But somebody out there will still be carrying what happened." Those words lingered in the cold air between them. Because that was the truth about nights like Westfield Avenue. The flashing lights eventually disappear. The reports get filed away. The crowds go home. But humiliation stays with people long after the storm passes. Marcus wrapped one arm gently around his father's shoulders as they stepped inside together. The house smelled faintly of old books, coffee, and memories untouched by time. Earl carefully placed the military medal back onto the living room shelf beneath a framed photograph of his late wife. Then he turned off the lamp beside the couch and stood quietly in the darkness for a moment. "I do not need revenge, Marcus," he said softly. "I just want people to see us before they judge us." Marcus looked at his father standing there beneath the dim hallway light, a man who had survived war, grief, injustice, and age without letting hatred poison his spirit. And in that moment, Marcus finally understood something deeper than anger. Real strength was not wearing a badge. Real strength was carrying dignity through a world that kept trying to take it away. Outside, the storm clouds slowly drifted beyond the city skyline, while the streets of Columbus fell silent again. But somewhere in that silence, the truth remained. A badge can command fear, but only humanity earns respect.